long. That's all at the end of the forecast period.
Sorry, if you don't mind. Do you not think the sort of weaker sentiment coming through in the surveys might be sort of because of the autumn tax rises?
Could be. I mean, it's always difficult to know. I think businesses kind of realised pretty quickly after October that what it meant. Maybe some of the sort of very recent sentiment is partly a reflection of a growing realisation that we could be in for a major blow to trade. That wasn't there clearly in October, November. People know who the next president will be, but you never quite know what they might do. And now it seems a bit clearer that there's a real risk of tariffs.
And we'll quickly do the second half of the question, which was, what are the chances of the headroom being retained through to the autumn, and will the Chancellor have to make changes to tax? Do you want to take that, Tom?
Yeah, thanks. So, as Richard said in his presentation, the £9.9 billion worth of headroom is very small compared to the risks around the forecast. We assess the probability of meeting the target with that amount of headroom is basically around 50%. It's a central forecast, so we think there are risks in both directions, broadly balanced. But the risk analysis that Richard showed, that it would not take much to eliminate that headroom again. So a 0.6% increase in gilt and interest rates, a 0.1% lower productivity, the worst case tariff scenario that Richard showed could eliminate the headroom. But as I say, yeah, it's a central forecast, so we think the risks are broadly in both directions.
Great. This gentleman here.
Thank you, David Robinson, Market News. You've done something the Bank of England hasn't done, which you've got quite clear scenarios around different scenarios, but you don't get persistent inflationary effects. Just explain why you don't, and how confident you are you in that assumption that there won't be persistent inflationary effects from tariffs?
You take that, David.
Yeah. It's partly because there's well, for a start, if the UK, if there's a tariff war between various countries, but the UK stays out of it, maybe people put tariffs on us, but we don't reciprocate, then there isn't an increase in prices of stuff coming into the UK because we're not the ones who are applying tariffs. So it isn't much of a mystery that in those circumstances you don't get a big inflation effect on the UK. Now, one of the scenarios is it's all out war, everybody retaliates, whatever's done to them, they do back to whoever did it. And that is a bit more inflationary, but it's also more depressive of economic activity and GDP. And that is something of an offset. Furthermore, if you remember what a tariff does, it leads to a sort of step change in the price of imports if you're the one applying a tariff on stuff coming into your country. It's a kind of step change in the price of things that people buy. Unless there are second round knock-on effects, then it doesn't cause ongoing inflation. So it becomes a question really about whether the short-run impact, which is almost immediate because suddenly the prices of things you import goes up quite a lot, or the prices of things you import from those countries that are applying tariffs to you, and that may only be one country, that will only generate ongoing inflation if, for example, in wage negotiations, Labour tries to claw back the effects of the first round effect of the tariff having gone up. And then you get into a question of, well, if a tariff war like that makes the economy weaker and unemployment a little bit higher, and there's more slack in the economy, those second round effects will be quite weak anyway. So it's a kind of long-winded answer. But in a nutshell, that's why it isn't the main effects on inflation, probably.
Thanks, David. Any more new questions in the room? One just in front of you, Jesse.
Paul Wallace. I'd like to just ask you about welfare reform and whether really it was wise to introduce changes in the welfare system against this particular objective of making savings to apply for 2029. I mean, we know that welfare reform consistently has effects which weren't anticipated by policymakers. So that seems to increase the doubt about making them in such a rush.
Tom?
Thanks. Well, so we're very clear in the analysis that we have done that there is a huge amount of uncertainty around the estimated savings from the welfare reform package. Partly that is because, as we've set out in the report, a number of the analysis of the changes that were made was given to us relatively late in the process and without the usual level of analysis and evidence that we would usually require to do these kind of costings. But there's also just a huge amount of uncertainty around the underlying forecast of welfare spending. So welfare spending in particular on working age, disability and health-related benefits has increased very rapidly over the past few years, from around 30 billion around the time of the pandemic to around 50 billion now. And we're forecasting, even after the impact of these measures, that it will rise by a further 15 billion pounds over the forecast. But the drivers of that increase that we've seen in the recent past is quite uncertain. It's quite likely to be driven by a number of different factors. So there is evidence that the health of the working age population has declined, partly because the working age population is aging due to demographics, but also there's evidence that in particular there's a rise in mental health conditions amongst younger people in the working age population. So health is likely a driver. It's also likely the case that there are economic factors driving that increase. So in particular, huge cost of living pressures that we've seen over the past few years, likely to increase financial incentive for people to claim health-related benefits which have a higher reward than the non-health-related benefits. And then also it's quite likely that there's just been quite a lot of change in the structure and operation of the benefit system over that period, which is also likely to have driven some of this change. So that means that the forecast is obviously uncertain, and the evolution of the economy and these kind of health trends, as well as policy, are likely to have a big impact on the actual evolution of spending over the next few years.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to take some questions from Slido because there's lots on there. I'll come back to the room for a second round in a bit, so you're allowed to go again if you've thought of another one. But some questions online, probably going to come to you first on a couple about the Employment Rights Bill and Make Work Pay, David. Sue Chan asks, you've understandably not costed the impact of the Employment Rights Bill, but you say that regulations that affect flexibility will likely have material and probably negative economic impacts on employment prices and productivity. Please elaborate. And Mauricio Alensar at CTM similarly asks, the OBR did not make an analysis of the government's plan to make work pay. When will the OBR make this assessment of policies in the bill? So a couple of similar questions there for you, David.
Yeah, well, we haven't come up with any estimate of what the impact of making work pay measures is going to be, because it's still a little bit up in the air. There'll be legislation going through quite soon, but then there may be secondary legislation, and some of it will be changed with amendments. So a bit difficult to know where it might end up. So that's why we didn't do anything this time round. In terms of what might happen, well, I think that will depend very much on what actually ends up being the law. Things which reduce the flexibility of employment contracts from the point of view of the employer, in many cases might have a mild impact, but when they do have an impact, I mean, it's probably negative to some extent. So altering, for example, the ability of employers to ask people to be flexible with the hours that they work and saying that there are much less flexibility, it's hard to see that as anything other than possibly a mild negative on employment. Bringing forward the date at which people have sort of full rights to go to tribunals and such, making it somewhat more difficult to have probationary periods, if that ends up being part of the legislation. Again, might have limited effect on most employers, but there will be some where the effect, if anything, will be somewhat negative. So too early to try and quantify any of that, but probably on balance, the risks are that it's slightly negative for employment.
Thanks, David. This one is a question for you, I think, Tom. Peter Ward asks, what are you forecasting for reductions in tax receipts as a result of the hundreds or thousands of the top 1% of taxpayers who provide around 30% of income tax receipts exiting the UK for other more tax-friendly jurisdictions?
Thanks. So we made some assumptions at the October budget around the impact of the measures that were announced then, in particular on carried interest and on non-domiciles, that those measures would lead to an increase in high net worth individuals leaving the country, roughly in the sort of low thousands. We've not updated that assumption at this event, and we haven't seen any sort of strong evidence since October that would have led us to do that. The government has made one change to the non-dom reforms, but we judged that would not have a material impact on those judgments. I mean, more broadly, talking about the kind of uncertainties and risks around the forecast, all of our fiscal forecasts are based on the assumption that the tax to GDP ratio rises over the forecast period to what would be a historic high, around 5 percentage points higher than it was at the pandemic, around 2 percentage points higher than it is now. That's largely driven by policy decisions that the current government took at the last budget, but also that the previous government took when they froze personal tax thresholds. But that is another area of significant kind of risk and uncertainty around the forecast as to whether those policies will deliver the tax that we expect. Obviously, all the uncertainties that we talked about in terms of the economy are very relevant in terms of tax take as well.
Thank you very much, Tom. Richard, I'm going to come to you. Just a couple more questions on tariffs. Someone asked for clarification of whether our forecasts include any tariffs or not. And David Maddox from The Independent asks, how precarious are your forecasts given the possibility of Trump imposing tariffs next week? And even if he doesn't, the requirement for the government to meet its house building targets. So a couple of uncertainties there. Do you anticipate being forced to make major changes? So mostly tariffs with a little bit of house building too.
So our central forecast is based on the IMF's January World Economic Outlook for the global economy, which was also the practice followed by the Bank of England in their recent forecasts, which didn't include any impact from the new US tariffs on the global economy and therefore on our global forecast. As you saw in the presentation, the impact of the additional tariffs that have been imposed so far on Mexico, Canada and China are relatively limited for the UK in the medium term, but scenarios where the US imposes much more significant tariffs on the rest of the world, on Europe, on the UK, do have material impacts on our growth forecast up to 1% in next year at the peak, and can have quite big fiscal effects. So I would say our forecast is very sensitive to what US tariff policy turns out to be, which we will find out more about in the coming days. I would say it's less sensitive to what happens on the housing side, partly because house building, it only really ramps up additional house building only really ramps up towards the end of the forecast. Even at the end, it's only adding about 0.2 to potential output by the 5th year of the forecast, and it's generating the better part of £3 billion worth of extra revenue by the end of the forecast. So not hugely sensitive to housing, but significantly sensitive to what happens in global trading arrangements.
Thanks, Richard. This one is, I think, for you, David, from Philip Inman at The Guardian. The Chancellor said public investment would crowd in private investment, but the OBR believes it will crowd out the private sector. Can you explain why when you say that slack and the output gap has increased?
Well, it looks like because we had relatively low growth last year, particularly in the second half of the year, and that seems to continue at least into the early part of this year, and we think it's going to be another low growth year. I mean, that is opening up a bit of slack in the economy that we think. And you sort of see signs of it in the labour market with vacancies have come down really quite sharply recently, and firms' hiring intentions seem to have slackened off. So that's pretty clear evidence, I think, that there is opening up a bit of slack in the UK economy. On the question about investment and crowding in and crowding out, it depends what kind of investment one's talking about. Public sector investment now, one is talking about. If you get a lot more investment on transport, on building new roads to areas of the country, that's likely to have positive knock-on effects on private sector investment. Housing probably doesn't have that same sort of effect, and that's the main increase in investments taking place. Although I should say, of course, that the extra house building that we think is coming is not government building houses itself. It is allowing more houses to be built by the private sector. So that's kind of directly increasing private sector investment because that's what it is. What was the third part of the question? Maybe it wasn't the third part of the question.
No, I think you've done a decent job on the main bits.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you to say.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We've got loads, so we'll rattle through a few more. A question on our asset purchase facility assumptions. Louis Ashworth from FT Alphaville asks, why are you still forecasting active sales of gilts from the asset purchase facility based on only figures for the first 2 years of quantitative tightening? You able to take that one, Tom?
Thanks. So in terms of that assumption, it's obviously the Monetary Policy Committee that take decisions on the pace of QT, APF unwinds. They set out a plan just for the year ahead, so we obviously take that plan for the year ahead, and then we make an assumption for the following years, which is based on what the MPC has done in the past and statements they've said about the overriding principles that will guide their decisions in the future, which we think is a reasonable methodology. I mean, it is an area like everything else in the forecast that we kind of review and look at each time. I think one thing to be clear on is the impact that this has on the Chancellor's chances of meeting her fiscal targets, which has changed over the last year or so, given the Chancellor's new fiscal rules and the fact that the current budget deficit is now the binding constraint. And therefore, the element of APF losses that feed into the current budget is the interest losses only, rather than the losses that are made on sales of gilts. So it is the case now that a faster pace of APF unwinds will actually reduce the impact of the APF on the current budget. So a faster rate of APF unwind would actually make it easier for the Chancellor to hit her target rather than more difficult.
Thank you. Do we have anyone in the room? Okay, good. We'll take these two and then a final couple from Slido starting here.
Just back to tariffs. So in the scenario where everyone is retaliating and the UK does retaliate, the UK manages to get some fiscal claws back, some revenues, but it doesn't necessarily seem to make the growth or the inflation impact worse, which would suggest that a UK retaliating in a world where everyone is retaliating is actually, could be fiscally a little bit more beneficial and not have that much side effects. Am I making the correct assumption? And then just on a couple of things, defence spending. You've sort of forecasted a 3% scenario, how much it would in terms of borrowing. What would the growth impact of that be? Could it be enough to offset some of the other fiscal consolidation in other parts? And then just finally on the government's promise to deregulate. It doesn't really feature much in the EFO. Is that because you just don't know what deregulation looks like, that you just aren't able to put any sort of numbers on it? Or is that because deregulation in and of itself is not going to be materially impactful for the public finances?
Excellent. Another great trio. Richard, Why don't you have a go at all three? We've got tariffs and retaliation, growth impacts of defence spending, and what we think about deregulation.
So on tariffs, in a nutshell, the revenue benefits that you might get from retaliating are offset by the hit that you get from being caught up in the trade war. And also, by putting tariffs on imports, you are, as David was pointing out, raising your own price level, putting up inflation. The government has got lots of inflation-linked expenditure, including the triple lock on pensions, including index-linked debt. And so inflation can be costly for governments as well as the impact that it has on the real economy. So for government, there are as many negative fiscal effects as there are positive ones from engaging in a trade war. On defence, getting to 3% from the 2.5%, which is where the government has now paid to get itself by 2027, costs around an extra £17 billion a year in 2030 money, although we're not quite sure when that ambition is going to be achieved. We would look at what the government's defence investment plans were once those more clearly set out. I guess it's important to point out that the government hasn't actually done a spending review yet, right? So we're not quite sure how they're going to fit this ambition in alongside all the other ambitions they have for health, education, transport, etc. over the next 5 years. We will look at that in the round against our potential output framework. A lot depends actually on whether this is investment in buying equipment from abroad or buying equipment domestically and as an investment in the UK's domestic production base. As well as other considerations. So it's something which we would have to look at in the round. And then just on kind of wider deregulatory ambitions, we tend to not, until they're clearly specified as a set of policies that we can actually look at, take much note of those kind of ambitions in our forecast. Where like the defence ambition, there's a clear number but not a deadline, we can put a sort of number on it. I think just saying we're going to vaguely deregulate the economy is kind of hard to make sense of from our perspective.
Thanks, Richard. And here at the front.
Thank you. I was hoping to ask a little bit more about welfare. So initially, when the government made a series of announcements on welfare reforms, they claimed it would yield savings of £5 billion. And it looks like from the documents today that the actual savings from those initial announcements was £3.4 billion, and so they've had to do a bit more. And can I ask why did those reforms not yield as much as the government thought? And then I was just hoping to ask as well on net migration. I can see the figures have been revised up in terms of where the numbers will settle in the medium term. And you mentioned that they'll probably be revised higher again. What's the impact of that in terms of growth and other factors that you look at?
Great. I think we can hear from all of the panel on bits of that. So, Richard, can you start a little bit on the process around welfare? Tom, maybe a little on the welfare numbers, and then David on net migration.
Yeah, so just on the process on welfare, I mean, one thing to say is that this is very much a preliminary view from us on the overall impact of the welfare package. We got the overall package very late in the process after agreed deadlines were missed. We didn't get all of the detailed evaluation that we usually have alongside those measures in this forecast. And also, a number of the elements of the package are not particularly well specified. For example, there is in that a government commitment to introducing an employment support program, but that is pretty much all it says. We don't know how many people it's going to be operating upon, how it's going to be rolled out, what kind of support it's going to provide. So we will take a further look at this once the details of the whole green paper are clearer. In terms of what how our £5 billion compares to sort of other numbers in the government's own publications, maybe Tom can say a bit more.
Yeah, well, so the £5 billion worth of savings to welfare is the number that we have assessed and estimated in our publications. The 3.4 billion that I think you mentioned is the number that you get if you subtract from that the cost of DWP departmental spending to fund the employment support program that Richard mentioned, and also some additional money to fund fraud and error and some other programs, which add up to 1.4 billion. So the 3.4 is essentially 4.8 of Amy's savings minus 1.4 4 of DWP departmental spending. And both those numbers are consistent with the ones we have.
And a view on net migration, David?
Yes, you're absolutely right, of course. The number that we project coming down from the current recently very high levels of net migration toward, we thought that was going to be 315,000 a year, if I remember correctly. It's now something like 340, so it's about £25,000, 25,000 people, I should say, more. That's still a steep fall, and that looks almost inevitable given what's happening to visas, but it falls to a slightly higher level. So the question, what does it mean to have a slightly higher level, 25,000 a year more? Well, depends what kind of people. That's a weak answer, but it's true. Most of them are probably going to work. Therefore, in terms of aggregate GDP, almost certainly positive. In many ways, that's not the thing that matters for quality of life, because GDP per capita is the relevant number there. And there it's less obvious. It will depend on what people do, what salaries, earnings they get, what output they generate. Probably true that in the short run, to have more people coming into the country gets you a short-run fiscal benefit, even if their pay is relatively low. But if their pay is relatively low, beneath average pay in the people who work in the UK by some margin, then further down the road, it becomes fiscally neutral and may even turn to fiscally negative. So it depends very much on, well, who's coming.
Great. We'll finish up with a few questions from Slido. Tom, we've got some questions about the latest public finances data that was published on Friday, I think. One question, did you include the public finances data for February in this forecast? And another saying, considering the miss in the public finances data in February, how are you thinking about risks to your cash requirement forecast for the next fiscal year?
So quickly, we incorporated all of the information from the January ONS release, and quite a large proportion of the information from the February release, but not the full release itself. And therefore, most of the news in there was incorporated in our forecast. I mean, it's always also important to say that there's always a lot of month-to-month movement in those numbers. A lot of revisions take place after the initial month, and a lot of volatility, in particular in public spending and local authority components of those releases. So it's wise not to put too much weight on any individual month.
Thank you. Richard, a question on departmental spending. The OBR stated unprotected departments' spending will need to be reduced by 0.8% in real terms by 2027-28. But the Chancellor said that spending across all departments will rise every year in real terms. How do both statements hold?
So both the statements true. The Chancellor's statement was about the overall growth in the spending envelope, which does grow by about 1.2% beyond next financial year, so over the next spending review period, over which they're now concluding the spending review process. So overall spending is growing by about 1.2. Within that, if you take a sort of reasonable view of what based on historical precedent, health has got, you meet the defence commitment, you meet pressures in schools and elsewhere. What that leaves for the so-called unprotected departments would be, based on our estimates, real cuts in their budgets year on year of around 0.8. So the Chancellor's statement was about the overall envelope for spending, but within that, once you take account of pressures on some pretty big ticket items like the NHS, that does leave real cuts for some other departments. I should say that 0.8 is less than what the real squeeze was in our last forecast, and that's partly because there's been this swap between current spending for ODA in terms of into capital spending for defence. So that's freed up a bit of pressure on current budgets, which is what most of the unprotected departments spend. It's also significantly less than we saw in our forecast this time last year, but it's nonetheless real terms reductions in that group.
And because that was succinct, I'm afraid get another question. A bonus question from Bertie, who says you have assumed fuel duty, a fuel duty increase will be actioned again versus the political choice of not increasing. You say it's 3.8 billion of revenue, which eats again into the headroom by about a third. Why do you keep doing this?
We do it because that's what the law says we have to do, which is take stated government policy and put it into our forecast. After complaints by the Treasury Select Committee about this charade, they've also asked us to put in an alternative scenario which shows what governments have actually done year on year since 2011, which is to freeze fuel duty or indeed cut it in some events. And so we also produce a version of our forecast, including our assessment performance against the fiscal rules, which includes that freeze on fuel duty, which would be more in line with what governments have actually done over the last 15 years, rather than what governments have promised they would do over the last 15 years. Even in that scenario, the Chancellor's still got some headroom left because she's left herself £10 billion, but it is a significant knock to that.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions on real household disposable income, David. There's a big upgrade to our HDI in 2024. Is that where the growth comes from? John Paul Ford Rojas asks, the Chancellor boasts of higher living standards, but they only go up after the tax threshold freeze ends. How likely is that to happen? And does that mean an RHDI recovery is less certain? Philip Inman at The Guardian asks, there is a significant increase in per capita incomes next year. Can you explain what lies behind that? So I think that's a few questions in and around per capita GDP and RHDI.
Okay, quickly. The main boost to real household disposable income in the short run, it comes from the fact that wage settlements are running quite a long way ahead of inflation at the moment. I mean, we think that's going to slow down. It's somewhat transitory, but while it lasts, it's the main driver of higher real household disposable income, because not surprisingly, for most households, nearly all of their income comes from employment, and wage settlements have been running at 5-6% or so, and inflation's now dipped under 3%. Further down the road, we think wage settlement's going to come down to barely exceed the rate of inflation, and that slows down the rate of growth of real household disposable income. Over the 5 years as a whole of our forecast period, there's some growth in real household disposable income, but frankly, it's at a pretty low rate relative to the longer run history of the UK. I mean, it's something like 0.5% a year. Again, I'm making the past sound like a wonderful place, but in the old days, one got used to productivity being around about 2% real a year, and so people's real income was going up. Most people's real income was going up by about 2% a year. So 0.5% a year for 5 years would be a really period of very low growth in real household disposable income.
Great. My watch hasn't ticked over yet, so Richard, a final question for you. It's a good one to end on. In a £2.5 trillion economy, why is headroom of £9 billion so low? Any project manager would have a risk pot of around 5 to 10%. You've listed many risks. Are we going to see them scored in future?
So what we always do around our central forecast is show where the risks lie. We try and take a central path through that risky world, but I think it's fair to say that the UK has experienced a lot of shocks over the recent past, and the bigger the shocks have got, the lower the headroom that chancellors have left themselves, which is clearly something which goes against one's expectations. I think one of the challenges chancellors have faced in trying to rebuild headroom in the current environment is the fact that we have a very high stock of debt, and interest rates have been rising as these shocks have hit the UK economy. And that just means that the first claim on public resources is always servicing the debt, and that has become more and more expensive over time. And that's eaten into the fiscal space that chancellors otherwise have to make difficult fiscal choices. And you probably saw in that chart that I showed earlier that there was suddenly a step down in the level of headroom that chancellors retained against their fiscal rules around the sort of early 2020s, and that was the point when interest rates really started going up, from less than 1% up to where they are now, around between 4.5% and 5%, and that has really eaten into the sort of spare resources available to chancellors, and an awful lot of the difficult fiscal decisions they've had to make in the recent past has been in response to the fact that servicing the very large stock of debt that we now have as a country has become a lot more expensive, and they've got to find some resources to enable them to do that. That's one of the reasons why taxes have gone up, and it's one of the reasons why they're having to make these reductions in spending.
Thank you. That definitely is all we've got time for. So apologies as always to those whose questions we didn't get to. Do follow up with us if you'd like answers or further information. And I'll just finish by saying thanks to everybody for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event following the publication of our Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report in the summer.